Hi and welcome back to part 2 of the Buler jump hour, and in this part the watch has gone through the cleaning machine and everything has been cleaned, and reassembly begins with refitting of the spring. I normally skip this bit and don't show it because the routine is pretty much the same for all, but thinking about it, I wasn't sure if I'd actually shown the process. Essentially, I use a bit of paper with a little bit of grease and run the entire spring through that just to give it a coating, essentially for anti-corrosion purposes rather than anything else. And then using my old watch mainspring winder that you see here, the appropriate size is selected, the mainspring is wound into the barrel and the tail of the mainspring fed in with tweezers, which you can just about see off screen there. This is then placed into the barrel and the plunger pressed, which deposits the spring neatly into the barrel. It's important to make sure that you use period specific lubricants on old watches. And then with the mainspring arbor oiled, this is fitted into place, and a quick check to make sure that the hook of the barrel arbor is hooked into the slot of the spring. The upper side of the arbor is then oiled and the barrel lid is snapped into place. Ordinarily I will use a barrel closer to snap a barrel lid into place because it gives even pressure all the way round. With this type of barrel lid, however, there's a riveted on gear, a wheel, which means that you're not able to press down on the barrel lid unless you specifically made a closer that fitted around this wheel. So what I do there, as you can see, is use a pair of tweezers to work my way around the barrel and snap that into place. We then move on to the upper side of the watch. The central wheel is fixed in position and this is lubricated before any further assembly begins. And then with the pivot lubricated with grease, the winding works and this intermediate gear wheel are fitted into place. I've just placed the setting lever screw into position there momentarily so that I don't forget to lubricate that and refit it before the main plate goes on, which I have done in the past. Not just with this type of watch, but with many types of watches, with the plunger type and with the screw type. So to try and avoid that, I usually pop those into place first so that it's a visual reminder that it's there. It's then removed, greased and refitted as you see there. Next up is refitting the train of wheels. And on this watch it's a little difficult, and on watches of this type in general it's a little difficult, and that is because these pivots are going into 0.4mm holes which are drilled directly into the plate, so they're not immediately obvious to the naked eye, especially as there are several holes dotted around and about the main plate that you can see there. And you have to get in close with a loupe to see where you're locating these pivots, because it's virtually indistinguishable from the rest of the plate, unlike a jeweled movement where you can spot the jeweled holes very, very easily. As you saw with disassembly, the entire train, including the mainspring barrel, is held in place by one single plate, and that is one of the things that makes reassembly of this watch a little tricky compared to most. And it's always tricky when you have a a bridge that covers several wheels at once, because you have several pivots to wiggle into place. It's even more so when you're working with a pin pallet escapement, which is going into holes that are drilled in the plate rather than jeweled holes. Now, what I have done in this video is I've left the full part of the video where I fit this cover plate, just to kind of give you an idea of the little bit of fiddling and wriggling around of wheels that might be involved in refitting one of these. And it can in fact take much longer than it does in this particular example. There is no magic secret to fitting the bridge onto one of these and getting everything to line up. It's simply a matter of patience, going carefully. You try to drop the bridge on as squarely as possible from the outset and apply gentle pressure either with your finger or a piece of pegwood. But keyword there, of course, is gentle. But bear in mind this is going over 4 screw holes, which are a relatively tight friction fit, and over the setting lever screw as well, in addition to the pivots and the barrel arbor. So it is a little bit of a juggle, as you can see. But that said, it's not impossible. As I say, it takes a little bit of practice, a little bit of patience, and the occasional rude word, and just a bit of poking and prodding in general. Once everything is seated correctly, press the plate down firmly once you're absolutely certain that all the pivots are located properly, and not before, because snapping a pivot is incredibly easy. You'll note that the second wheel actually had a broken pivot on this watch when I stripped it, and that has been replaced. And we then start to refit the screws. The main bridge is held in place by 4 screws, and all 4 of these screws perform a secondary function. The 2 that you can fit immediately are the one that I'm fitting right now, which holds the click in place, and then the one to the lower left of the screen, which holds the retainer, which is a special shape screw with a built-in washer, and this prevents the click from bending forward under the pressure of the mainspring barrel trying to rotate. And if that screw wasn't there, it could actually make the click spring bend forward and disengage from the wheel, allowing the mainspring pressure to just come straight out of there. And you'll see that a little bit more clearly after I've fitted the crown wheel here. As you can see, I just bend the click back there to make sure that it makes contact, and you can see there's a little shaped part just under the screw where the tweezers are, and that screw makes sure that it holds that in place and stops it slipping forward under pressure from the mainspring barrel, where the winding pinion actually contacts. This, of course, is a left-hand thread, as is common on most watches. The ratchet wheel is fitted next, but just prior to that, the barrel arbor is oiled. And using a pair of brass tweezers to hold the ratchet wheel in place, I tighten up the screw on the ratchet wheel. And a quick wind there just to check that everything is spinning smoothly before fitting the pallet fork. And the pallet fork is a little bit of an unusual shape on these, and obviously it is not like your traditional anchor shaped pallet fork with jewels. It has two upright pins which contact with the escape wheel, which is also a slightly different shape to your standard Swiss lever escapement. Placing the pallet cock and checking that the pivots are lined up in the holes. This is then held in place and screwed into place. And before it is screwed down fully, I check once again to make absolutely certain that the pivots are lined up correctly in the holes and everything's working as it should. Because again, I can't stress enough how easy it is to break a pivot if you don't take care during the reassembly process. At this point I add one full wind, which is something I do, a habit of mine. Many people will put several winds on. I personally like to add one full wind when I reassemble a watch before refitting the balance. For the simple reason, this shows if I have good motion through the train. If I get an amplitude of around 180 degrees, or possibly even just a little bit less, with one full wind of the mainspring, I know I've got good free running train and the power is getting through adequately. And then the final screw for the bridge goes into place, and as mentioned before, as you can see, all four screws perform a secondary purpose as well as holding the bridge in place. There's a little intermission here, as it were. I just want to point out that recently I picked up from eBay, because they happen to be there and quite cheap, this set of springs, this set of KIF or Trior shock spring removers and refitting pins. And it's a set of 3 in a little plastic case like this. And inside the case were 3 little pill type containers with some spare springs and 3 different sized KIF spring removers. And just out of curiosity, I've taken these out of the drawer. I actually bought these because they were there, they were cheap, and it was a novelty, and quite frankly, I like novel tools. And I don't need one because my KIF removal tool for a long time has been this modified toothpick. Well, not specifically this modified toothpick, it's kind of like Trigger's broom, but a modified toothpick, as it were. And what I do is I shave down the end, hollow out the end. One's slightly smaller than the other, and these will do the vast majority of KIF springs and Seiko Diashock and Diafix and the like. And Diashock, sorry, not Diafix. And it works really, really well. But out of curiosity, because obviously the BFG866 has the KIF Trior type springs, I thought I would try these, and I've just tried I'll just get the other 2 here so you can kind of see that they are actually 3 different sizes. Hopefully you can see there the fittings. There's 3 of them. They are slightly different sizes, and you kind of have to juggle and find the one that fits best. Strangely, there's one that looks like brass and 2 that look like steel. I'm not sure why. It happens that the brass looking one is the right size for this particular spring. The other two will unlock it, but only one will actually fit it and compress it enough to lock it in place. And I'm actually going to try and get a low view so that you can see the removal and refitting. And although I wasn't actually going to show the removal and refitting of these because it's fiddly to do so, and I've shown the sort of oiling and removal and refitting of the balance pivot jewels on several of my other videos. But what I'm going to do is try and show you a video of removing and refitting with both of these tools. Interestingly, and I've got to say, I found this really quite simple to use, and it's thin enough that you could mount this in a screwdriver handle or a pin vise. However, because I'm so used to using this, which is about the same diameter, and just using it accordingly, I've just had a quick play with this one, removed and refitted the spring a couple of times with this, and it works just fine. So it's really interesting. So I can recommend, if you happen across one of these sets and it's cheap enough, I mean, don't go spending silly money on them, because a cocktail stick or a piece of pegwood will do the job perfectly well, as any old watchmaker will tell you. And so back to the reassembly. I'm just pointing out here the lubrication points, and lubrication is as per any jeweled movement, with the addition of lubricating the pallet pivots, because everything is running in metal, so it's a metal pivot running in a metal hole, and the only jewel on this watch is the capstone on the top. The capstone on the bottom, as you can actually see here, is a small metal disc in the shape of a jewel capstone. Seems like an odd thing to do. Obviously the jeweled one goes on the top because that's typically the position it will be in, say with your hand resting on the table, or when you sit the watch down if you take it off. But it just seemed like an odd choice when they designed these to not put a jeweled capstone on both ends, frankly. But I guess it made it cheap enough to warrant doing that, because these were just a cheap throwaway movement really. So with the pivot points oiled on the dial side, the cannon pinion assembly just slots straight on. And note that this is unique to the jump hour version, as is the main plate, which is slightly larger. But the rest of the movement behind is exactly the same as any BFG866. And likewise with the cannon pinion, our wheel on a standard one, which would use hands, is just slips over the post, and you would lubricate the post as you normally would before fitting a normal hour wheel. So fit the winding pinion and the clutch, and then add some lubrication to the slot on the clutch before fitting the yoke. Here I'm just lubricating the pivot that the yoke sits on, although it doesn't move very much around this pivot. There is a little bit of movement. And this is quite a long single piece which can only fit in one way. So it's fitted into the slot. The screw that secures it is tightened slightly. And then the upper end is moved into place in its groove. And this is what the screw is then tightened up fully, and this is what gives the yoke its springiness, rather than having a separate shepherd's crook spring. And there I'm adding just a little bit of lubrication to the top where it bears on the top side of the groove. Again, minimal movement, but there is a little there. Next to be fitted is the setting lever. This is placed in position, at which point I lift the movement away, hold the setting lever in position with the finger of my left hand and tighten up the setting lever screw, which went off camera there, hence the reason you didn't see that. But there you can see the whole thing fitted into position and in winding and hand setting position accordingly. Next we start reassembling the dial side. First thing to note is you have 3 different length screws that go onto the first brass plate, which secures the date ring in place. So here I'm lubricating the 2 points which have moving parts on, one of which is the star wheel that rotates and moves the date around once every 24 hours. There is no quick set feature on these. And then the next part is a small metal ring. Oh, my apologies, there's a little brass spring there which sits over the main pinion and our wheel assembly. Following this is a small metal ring which is the jumper for the date ring, and this just sits on a raised point on the plate. The date ring is then placed. It doesn't sit into any specific groove, but it's quite obvious where it locates, and then the brass plate which secures it all in place is put on top. That locates into 3 slots and it has 3 screw holes. The screw hole that's uppermost, the first one that's going in there, is the short screw. The longer screws will not screw fully down into this hole, and you will damage them, snap the heads off if you try to do so. So do bear that in mind. The other 2 screws are fitted as normal, and then the spring for the jumper, with a little bit of grease added, is slid through the slot into place and seated there. Now if you look down there where my tweezers were pointing, you'll actually see the slightly longer finger of the brass star that moves the date around. Having moved the date around until it just clicks over, we then place the next wheel, which is the hour wheel. This has 2 sets of numbers going 1 to 12, because obviously there are 2 sets of 1 to 12 in a day, and it's placed with the 12 uppermost and at the uppermost and downmost point. And it doesn't matter which way around, one isn't PM and one isn't AM specifically. Similarly, the 2 points that the star that moves the hour wheel and the jumper are lubricated. Making sure that the 12 remains at the uppermost position and the star meshes with the wheel in the center, and then the holding plate, like the brass one, fits onto 2 locating lugs. Make sure that's pressed down firmly and is secured in place with 2 screws of equal length, so it doesn't particularly matter which goes where. Once this is in place, another spring for the hour wheel jumper is lubricated and slid into place. This is more of a traditional shepherd's crook type spring. I then run this through a full rotation of 24 hours to make sure that it works properly and that the date clicks over at 12 PM as it should. The final part is the minute wheel, and this is a press fit right into the center, and as mentioned in the disassembly, this is the bit that's particularly difficult to remove because it's a friction fit and you only have 2 little slots which aren't particularly good to allow you to get that off. At this point here, I'm lining up the window to make sure that the 0 is in line with the hour jumper. What you will notice as you watch this is I spent so long focusing on the date changing rather than it changing the hour that I actually misaligned the minute wheel. So after fitting the dial, screwing that into place and fitting the seconds hand and then trying it, I realised this and had to remove the seconds hand and dial, remove the centre dial, and then realign that again, focusing on the hour jumping rather than the date jumping. It was just a simple oversight, but a little annoying nonetheless. And just before placing the dial, I'm just using a bit of Rodico to sweep across the dial there, just to remove any stray little fibres or errant marks that may have been there, before securing the dial in place with its 2 securing screws, top and bottom. And once the minute wheel had been corrected and the assembly was completed, the movement is recased and regulated on the time grapher, and this is then left to check accuracy over a couple of days. And there I'm just tweaking the seconds hand up ever so slightly because it was quite close to the dial. So in conclusion, with the Buler Jump Hour watch, as you saw, the rebuild was completed and lubricated. The points on the lubrication, ordinarily you would not lubricate pallet fork pivots. In the case of any pivot like this that is running directly in a pivot hole or a bushing, I always lubricate them. It's better to have the risk of a slight reduction in amplitude due to lubrication of the pivots than to not have them lubricated at all. Only when running in dual holes do you leave them not lubricated. Also, the pins of the escapement of the pallet fork are lubricated. Because again it's metal bearing on metal. Other than that, lubrication is pretty much the same as for any other. On rebuild, it was evident that while the watch was running well and giving a good amplitude and a good trace for its type for a pin pallet movement, it was not keeping time correctly. On stripping this and inspecting the dial side and then looking further, this was found to be a loose slipping gear on the mainspring barrel. The friction on these watches is not from the cannon pinion being a friction fit, as you will typically find on a Swiss lever jeweled watch. It's actually from the separate gear which is affixed to the barrel lid on a friction fit pinion. That was quite loose, so using the staking set I tightened up the pinion enough that it was still that it gave enough friction to turn the hands to operate correctly, but still loose enough to allow you to set the time. That's pretty much it for the whole rebuild of this. The trace is showing sort of plus or minus 20-25 seconds depending on the position, and there's a little bit of positional error, as there typically is with these watches. You will not get super duper Swiss accuracy with these. These were a very cheap mass produced Swiss pin pallet movement. This particular one and the EB8800 are very, very commonly seen across many watches of this era. So I hope this was useful. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.